The phrase "New World Order" carries a weighty and convoluted history, one that cannot be separated from the ideological and geopolitical undercurrents of the last century. Over time, the term has been invoked by both world leaders and conspiracy theorists, albeit for strikingly different purposes. To understand the true depth of its use and overuse, particularly in contemporary discourse, we must first trace its origins, its context in key historical moments, and finally, the manner in which it has been appropriated and distorted by fringe movements, particularly within far-right circles. The origins of the phrase "New World Order" are inherently tied to the aftermath of great global upheavals. This is unsurprising given that major world events, wars, revolutions, and crises, often necessitate the reorganization of international relations. For instance, after the devastation of World War I, world leaders sought to prevent such carnage from ever happening again, and the establishment of the League of Nations was intended to do just that. Later, the creation of the United Nations after World War II followed a similar idealistic impulse, that peace could only be maintained through international cooperation and collective security. It was here, in this post-war milieu, that the notion of a new order for the world began to solidify in the public imagination. However, it was U.S. President George H.W. Bush who popularized the specific phrase "New World Order" during a speech on September 11, 1990. This marked a significant moment in the history of the term, as it was now being used to describe the geopolitical shift following the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Bush's vision of the New World Order was optimistic. A world where superpower rivalry would give way to collective action against aggression, and where international organizations, like the United Nations, would play a more central role in preserving peace. His address occurred at the onset of the Gulf War, and the New World Order was framed as an opportunity for the world to rally together against acts of unprovoked aggression, such as Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. For Bush and other leaders, the New World Order was thus an expression of hope, an era where international relations would be guided by diplomacy, peacekeeping, and multilateralism rather than the hard-nosed realpolitik of the Cold War. In Bush's rhetoric, there was an underlying belief in the possibility of a world governed by law, not by force. But there was also an underlying assumption that the United States, having emerged victorious in the Cold War, would play a leading role in shaping this new order. This moment in history represents the term's most legitimate and aspirational usage, when it signified a desire for stability and cooperation in a rapidly changing world. But even as Bush was speaking, darker interpretations of the New World Order were beginning to circulate. It is here that the term crosses from high-level diplomacy into the murky waters of conspiracy theory. Anti-globalist ideologies, rooted in fears of elite control and loss of national sovereignty, began to adopt and twist the phrase to fit a narrative of creeping authoritarianism. This transformation was not sudden. In fact, the seeds of conspiracy around global governance can be traced back to much earlier periods, notably with the rise of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This notorious forgery, which emerged in the early 20th century, purported to outline a Jewish plan for world domination. It falsely accused Jewish leaders of secretly controlling world events, a narrative that was eagerly taken up by anti-Semites, especially in Europe and America. The conspiratorial framework established by the Protocols laid the foundation for many of the modern interpretations of the New World Order. While Bush used the phrase to describe a more peaceful, cooperative world, conspiracy theorists saw it as a code word for something far more sinister: the creation of a totalitarian world government by an elite cabal. Over time, these fears coalesced around the idea that international institutions, such as the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, were tools for elites to impose a global dictatorship that would strip nations of their sovereignty and citizens of their freedoms. These conspiracy theories gained particular traction during the Cold War, when the United States was in the grip of anti-communist paranoia. Right-wing groups like the John Birch Society played a crucial role in popularizing the idea that communist sympathizers had infiltrated American institutions and were using globalist rhetoric to further their agenda. In the Society's view, the New World Order was simply a cover for an international communist plot to subjugate the free world. This was a direct evolution of the fear that had been stoked by the Protocols *, but it now carried the additional baggage of Cold War anxiety. For many, the United Nations and other multilateral organizations were no longer seen as bastions of peace, but as vehicles for an authoritarian global regime. As the Cold War ended and the world moved toward an era of globalization, these conspiratorial fears did not subside. On the contrary, the new interconnectedness of the world economy, the rise of multinational corporations, and the increasing influence of international financial institutions were seen as further evidence that a new world order was being imposed from above. The phrase became a catch-all for any policy or development that was perceived to undermine national sovereignty, whether that be free trade agreements, environmental regulations, or immigration policies. For those who believed in these theories, the New World Order was not about peace and cooperation, but about control, the control of markets, borders, and ultimately, people's lives. By the time we reach the 21st century, the New World Order had fully cemented itself as a central pillar of conspiracy theories, particularly in the United States. The rise of the Internet provided fertile ground for these ideas to spread, and social media accelerated their reach. What had once been fringe ideas, confined to the margins of society, were now accessible to millions at the click of a button. Movements like QAnon, which emerged during the Trump presidency, capitalized on these long-standing fears, integrating them into a broader narrative about elite corruption and global domination. Events such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine were presented not as real-world crises, but as orchestrated steps in the grand plan of the New World Order. In these circles, world leaders, CEOs, and public figures were not merely flawed individuals, but actors in a grand conspiracy to enslave humanity. What makes these conspiracy theories so enduring is their adaptability. Historian Mark Pitcavage has argued that the New World Order is a vague and amorphous concept that can be tailored to fit any perceived threat. In the early 20th century, it was communism that was feared. Today, it is globalism. This flexibility allows conspiracy theorists to mold the term to fit contemporary anxieties, whether that be concerns about immigration, technological surveillance, or climate change. By framing these complex global issues as part of a nefarious plot, conspiracy theorists offer a simple explanation for the problems of the modern world, one that taps into deep-seated fears about control, power, and freedom. However, it would be a mistake to view the New World Order purely through the lens of conspiracy. Many political leaders have used the term to articulate genuine shifts in international relations. British Prime Minister Tony Blair, for example, invoked the New World Order after the 9/11 attacks to stress the need for greater international cooperation in the fight against terrorism. Likewise, Gordon Brown used the term in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, when he called for a new Bretton Woods system to regulate global finance. These uses of the term are grounded in reality. They recognize that in an increasingly interconnected world, challenges like terrorism, financial instability, and climate change cannot be solved by any one nation alone. And yet, the dual use of the term by both legitimate political leaders and conspiracy theorists has created a great deal of confusion. To some, the New World Order represents a hopeful vision of a more just and cooperative global society. To others, it is a harbinger of tyranny. This tension between optimism and fear is reflective of broader trends in political discourse, where terms that once carried specific meanings are increasingly being co-opted and distorted. Much the same can be said of the term far right. Historically, the far right has referred to movements that reject democracy in favor of authoritarianism, often characterized by nationalism, xenophobia, and militarism. However, in recent years, the term has been applied far more broadly, to the point where it often fails to distinguish between genuine extremism and more mainstream conservative or populist positions. This overuse has had serious consequences for political discourse. When populist movements like the UK Independence Party or France's National Rally are labelled far-right, it blurs the line between legitimate political opposition and extremism. The danger here is twofold. First, it dilutes the seriousness of the term far-right, making it harder to identify and address real threats to democracy. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazi organizations have long advocated for racial superiority and authoritarianism, and it is essential that we maintain a clear distinction between such groups and mainstream conservative movements. Second, it fosters political polarization, as those who are labeled far-right may feel unfairly targeted and pushed further to the margins of political life. This can create a vicious cycle, where political debate becomes increasingly hostile and divided. In conclusion, both the phrase New World Order and the term far-right have undergone significant transformations in meaning over the last century. For some, these terms represent genuine political realities, the challenges and opportunities of a more interconnected world. For others, they are symbols of fear, control, and conspiracy. As we move forward in an increasingly polarized political landscape, it is essential. In the early days, the phrase New World Order reflected optimism, emerging in periods of geopolitical shifts such as after the World Wars or during the Cold War's end. Leaders like Winston Churchill and U.S. President George H.W. Bush used the term to convey hope for international collaboration and peace. Bush, in particular, used it to mark a future where international law and collective security would replace Cold War rivalries, speaking at a time of potential unity and global governance led by institutions like the United Nations. However, while these high-minded ideals reflected genuine diplomatic efforts, the phrase quickly developed a more sinister connotation in the public imagination, especially among conspiracy theorists. The term began to represent a dystopian vision of a shadowy elite controlling world events to establish a totalitarian regime. This belief, rooted in a broader anti-globalist narrative, was bolstered by earlier conspiracies, notably the infamous Protocols of the Elders of Zion*, a fake document alleging a Jewish plan for world domination. While thoroughly debunked, the protocols cast a long shadow, fueling anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that have persisted for more than a century. These theories argue that international institutions and financial systems, like the United Nations and the World Bank, are controlled by a global elite, typically portrayed as Jewish bankers or powerful families like the Rothschilds. As the Cold War drew to a close, these conspiratorial fears shifted from communism to globalism. Far-right movements and anti-government groups in the United States, such as the John Birch Society, promoted the idea that globalism was a threat to national sovereignty. The European Union, in particular, became a focus of anti-globalist sentiment. To these groups, the New World Order wasn't about peace and cooperation but control, the erosion of national borders and traditional identities by a central, faceless authority. In the age of the Internet, these fears have only grown. Social media and digital platforms have allowed conspiracy theories to spread rapidly, giving rise to movements like QAnon, which blend age-old fears of elite control with new concerns about technology, immigration, and health crises. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine have both been framed by some conspiracy theorists as orchestrated events designed to accelerate the imposition of a New World Order. Amidst these debates, the term far-right has also evolved, often being overused or misapplied in political discourse. Historically, far-right referred to extreme nationalist or fascist movements that rejected democratic values. But in modern times, the term is frequently used to describe a wide array of conservative or populist movements, diluting its meaning. In countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, populist parties and movements have often been labeled far-right, even though their platforms focus on issues like immigration and national sovereignty rather than authoritarianism or white supremacy. This overuse has consequences. By labeling all forms of conservative dissent as far-right, it becomes harder to identify and address genuine extremism. For instance, groups like the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazi organizations, which have a history of advocating violence and discrimination, should not be conflated with mainstream political movements simply because they oppose globalist policies. Moreover, this broad application of the term can exacerbate political polarization, pushing those who feel unfairly labeled further into the margins and deepening the divide in political discourse. The rise of the New World Order, conspiracy theory, and the overuse of far-right both reflect the broader trends of our time: increasing polarization, fear of the unknown, and the desire for simple explanations to complex global problems. As we navigate this increasingly divided landscape, it is crucial to use language carefully and thoughtfully, understanding the historical roots and implications of the terms we use. By doing so, we can foster a more informed and productive political dialogue, one that addresses the real issues facing the world without resorting to fear-mongering or oversimplification.